The FBI hired an informant to infiltrate the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, instigate violence, and entrap activists in crimes, according to an investigative journalist. Informant Micheal Windecker was reportedly paid at least $20,000 to spy on protesters in Denver and turn peaceful protests into violent ones. He gained the trust of protesters and eventually became a leader in the movement, and accused the real leaders of working with the authorities while also setting up others to be arrested. Trevor Aronson is the host of the podcast Alphabet Boys, which covers how the FBI infiltrated racial justice protests in the summer of 2020. Aronson says the FBI used counterterrorism tactics against protesters.
The FBI used informants or undercover agents to put together terrorism plots that then they could attract people to be a part of, then foil them and announce to the public a terrorism plot foiled. It had been theory that I'd had that they were using these types of tactics that had been perfected during the War on Terror against protesters, but I couldn't prove it. It was something that I was searching for evidence of, and then finally a source was able to provide me with these records and these recordings that showed how the FBI had taken a violent felon and used him as an informant.
The tactics are similar to another program that the FBI used from the 1950s to the early 70s called the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI used informants to discredit, spy on, and disrupt political and civil rights organizations in the U.S. Targets included the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The intelligence was used to break up marriages, disrupt meetings, cast out people from their professions, and provoke targeted groups into conflicts that in some cases even resulted in death. In 1976, the actions taken under COINTELPRO were found to be illegal, and reforms were passed to regulate government surveillance and internal guidelines. But that all changed after 9/11.
The FBI was granted enormous powers post 9/11 to pursue and find would-be terrorists. And 20 years later, what we're finding is that many of those powers and practices are now being applied against political activists and non-terrorists.
With its restored powers, the FBI was able to have its informant infiltrate the Denver racial justice movement. The Bureau incentivized Windecker to manufacture crimes that Aronson explained likely would have never happened without his disruption. Windecker eventually went so far as to try and get activists to assassinate the Attorney General of Colorado, but none of them would go along with it.
And so in the case of Denver, what we have is an informant going in, spying on Americans who are not committing crimes, and then also encouraging Americans to commit violence that without the government's agent, they likely would not have done at all. Would there have been as much violence were it not for the government agent pushing for that violence and encouraging that violence? That's not something we can fully measure, but I do think it's quite troubling that we even have to ask the question, how much of the government's behavior in an undercover capacity resulted in some of the violence that we saw.